I'd like to introduce first Nancy Leek.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here at the Chico History Museum, and this is a beautiful podium. You're very lucky to have somebody so talented to make this furniture.
Yes, we are.
Yes, you are. Yes, I am part of Anchor, and we're an independent nonprofit research organization and publisher of books. And this book, which you can see on the screen there, John Brown's Family in Red Bluff, originally was written, this is the original format. It was published in 1986 by Anchor, and it's by Wilbert L. Fay, who was a history teacher, high school history teacher in Red Bluff. And he did a thesis on the John Brown family's home in Red Bluff. And we thought it really deserved to be reprinted. You know, this is the way we used to do books, and it's stapled together. And now, you know, we make really pretty books like this. And if you're wondering what the picture is on the cover, one of John Brown's daughters, Sarah Brown, was an artist, and this is actually her painting of Mount Diablo. So it's not a local scene, it's Mount Diablo, but it is by Sarah Brown. And I'm going to be telling you some things about the Brown family. But John Brown, of course, didn't come to California. He was hanged in Virginia in 1859. And his widow and some of the children did migrate to Red Bluff. And to start off, Ron Womack is going to give you some background about John Brown. The John Brown family home, that house is still in Red Bluff. You can go see it. It's on 135 South Main Street. It's right on Main Street. It's no longer a residence. I believe there's a business there that's a massage therapist. But I don't know. We think, wow, there's a 150-year-old or 175-year-old home there in Red Bluff. Well, of course, I once had a friend from Europe, took her to see some what I thought were old buildings, and she was not impressed at all. But the question is, how did the Brown family come to be living in Red Bluff? This is a picture of Mary Day Brown, John Brown's second wife. His first wife had died, and then he married Mary, and two of their daughters in 1851. Of course, by the time they came to Red Bluff, they were older than that. So I'm going to turn the time over to Ron. He's going to tell you about John Brown.
John Brown was born in 1800 to a poor Quaker family. And about the time he was born, things really began to change in America. We're all aware of the Louisiana Purchase, which opened up lands to the west. Even before then, there was a area called the Western Reserve, and it was an extension of the state of Connecticut. And it encompassed pretty much all of Ohio and I'm sure some other territory that I'm not familiar with. And in this territory, which also became the Northwest Territories, free blacks were welcome to get their emancipation. Of course, they had to carry their papers with them, and move into this area, buy land, and start their own farms. The social climate wasn't really on top of this movement, and so in many cases there were special taxes and other things that trying to discourage them. The prevalent belief amongst the abolitionists, and certainly the pro-slavery people, was that ex-slaves were really not bright enough to make it on their own. Oh, this one? Oh, that mic. I'm sorry. So at age 12, John goes to work herding cattle. When it really impressed him, because he's already an abolitionist, being from a Quaker family and a pacifist, was how poorly a Negro slave boy was treated compared to how he was treated, and they were about the same age and ability. At age 15, he was on his own and went to work, I'm sure, as an apprentice in a tannery. And his employers saw a lot of promise in John, his intellect, and they encouraged him to study on his own, which he did. At age 20, he married his first wife, Diane Lusk. That marriage lasted 12 years and 7 children. And at 31, I'm certain John took a special note of Nat Turner's slave rebellion. The object there was to arm slaves and turn them against their masters. And what it did show, one, of course, is that Nat Turner was executed, but also that there was power in numbers. There were a lot more slaves than there were slaveholders. So he lost his wife, Diane, at age 32 and remarried about a year later to Mary Day, who was spinning for them. That marriage lasted for until 1859 and 13 more children. Mind you, he was absent a lot, okay? This is also a time period when America was entering in the Industrial Revolution, and I don't know how many gray-haired people we have here, but they taught us that in around the 7th or 8th grade about what the Industrial Revolution was, and so John, in his mid-30s, is anxious to be a better provider for his family than raising sheep, which he became very good at, and subsistence farming. And he was given the North Elba farm by a man by the name of Reifschneider-Smith, and we'll go into how and why that happened. And so at that point, he was almost 50, and he actually had his own subsistence farm. Or was John a fanatic and a villain instead of a businessman and an entrepreneur? The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 galvanized the Browns, and certainly John and his 4 of his sons and 1 son-in-law to move to Lawrence, Kansas. And then 3 years later, he's executed at Harper's Ferry. It was raid on the Harper's Ferry arsenal. So this mural depicts John with a gun in one hand and a Bible in the other. And so each generation has made its own decision about who John Brown was. Now, at age 157, had he lived, he would have seen his idea of integration actually come to fruit in America with the integration of the Little Rock High School in 1957. And that belief in that black people and white people could live amongst one another was only shared by a minority of his abolitionist friends and benefactors. Well, above all, John was a family man. And the Quakers believed that women and men were equal in the sight of God. And so John would lead prayer every morning with his family. And when John was gone, Mary did the same thing. John even was a spiritual influence on all of his followers when they were about to go in to Harper's Ferry with prayer every morning. John was self-taught, as we have said. His family was totally and solidly behind him and his beliefs. He had a keen sense of injustice, determined to a fault, and he was honest as a day long, and he was, I think, very trusting, as we'll see. Sometimes that trust was misplaced. He was well-spoken, and he was very well-connected. And I believe in my own mind that had John not been so well-connected, he couldn't have led his revolt. He would have lived to be a ripe old age. Strong-willed, most certainly, and really stubborn. So in his lifetime, he experienced joy and tragedy. His marriages brought 20 children. He lost his first wife, and 10 of his children did not live to adulthood. I've entitled this John Brown capitalist slide, "The wolf of bad timing makes the rules." And John was a victim of terrible timing. Well, first he was a tannery owner, and he employed his sons in it, and apparently he did okay with that, but there were other ways to make a better living for his family. So he became a real estate developer, and that's still going on, right? He bought a large tract of land, but having no money really, he borrowed what he needed to buy this tract of land. He was going to subdivide it into smaller farms. Kind of like a larger version of the Durham land colony. Well, the wolf of bad timing brought the panic of 1837, right about the time he bought this land. And he was unable to sell the land, subdivided, and by age 42, he went bankrupt. So at age 42, he started over, and he had just enough, was left just enough to restart his family. He became a sheep expert, especially in the introduction of merino sheep, because of their fine quality wool. There was a man by the name of Perkins who was in the wool business and recognized John as being a wool expert and a good judge of fleece. He also liked John's honesty, and so he employed him to be his middleman, purchasing fleeces from wool growers and warehousing them and then selling them on the retail market. However, Congress had just dropped the tariff, protective tariff from European wool, another piece of bad timing. So he was unable to get the price he needed to get for his fleeces. Furthermore, the trusting John trusted the wool growers, and they would pack their fleeces with dirt to bolster the weight. Well, there wasn't much left to do, but he and Perkins decided that going to Europe with the fleeces was going to be the best way to sell them. They didn't sell. 3 months later, he brought the fleeces back, and they got a lower price than if he had not left to start with. And Perkins had this to say about John. I think it's probably the best description I've read of his character. Brown managed according to his own impulses. He would not listen to anybody, but did what he took into his own head. He was solicitous to go into business of selling wool, and I allowed him to do it. But he had little judgment, always followed his own will, and lost much money. He had a benefactor by the name of Garrett Smith. I believe he was in some kind of a legislative role, and I'm not sure which, at this point, not sure which Congress he was in, but this was a subsistence farm, and Garrett Smith believed, like John did, that black people and white people could live and farm amongst one another and live well. And it was said of the farm at North Elba, this is near Lake Placid, New York, and it is a national monument today. It was said of them, they never raise anything to sell off that farm, except sometimes a few fleeces. It was well, they said, if they raised their own provisions and could spin their own clothing. So they lived in poverty, but they did live. And John, of course, was part of the farm when he was there, but as time went on, as you'll see, he spent less and less time. And Mary and the children kept the farm going in his absence. Now about the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This opened Kansas and Nebraska as territories, and it was up to them to decide whether they were going to be slave states or free states. Well, in 1854, Kansas had 1,500 people in the whole state. And so abolitionists from the north began to pour in and settle. And they established 3 towns. Lawrence, Kansas on the Missouri border, which is depicted here. The town of Palmyra, which was on or very close to the Santa Fe Trail. And another town called Osawatomie. They were abolitionist strongholds. And prevalent amongst the powers that be in Kansas, there was a lot of voter fraud, trying to swing the vote so that the abolitionists would not have power in the legislature. You couple that with a governor who was anti-abolitionist. Now you've got 2 years of mayhem, and here we see the branches of government blurred. The abolitionist, or the pro-slavery people actually passed laws in the legislature that made it illegal to be an abolitionist. And that was, penalty of that was death or imprisonment. What you see here is the aftermath of the 1856 raid on Lawrence, Kansas. And that center building was a stone building that they blew up, and that was the political center of the abolitionist movement. They further raided Palmyra and Osawatomie, but the thing that really turned John Brown from pacifist to activist was the caning of Senator Sumner. He was a senator from Massachusetts, and after his 5-hour tirade against the slavery faction, the representative from the state of South Carolina waited for everyone to leave, especially the women, and he attacked Senator Sumner and nearly beat him to death with the head of his cane. This really clicked in John, is what I've read. And they set upon the little community that he and his sons were living in called Potawatomi. And it was a mixed area of settlement between pro-slavery and abolitionist people. And that night they killed 5, put them to the sword in the Southern chivalry style, which is what Sumner got from the representative from South Carolina. And from that point on, John was a wanted man. And he had to move in secret, and he had to move at night. And he was chased by a Captain Pate. And after Pate raided Lawrence, Palmyra, and killed John's son Frederick on the road going to Osawatomie, he took after John Brown. And John and his followers, numbering, it was less than 10, had already discovered the power of guerrilla warfare and were able to force Captain Pate into surrender at the Blackjack War. They got Captain Pate to the point where he couldn't advance, nor would they allow him to retreat, and so he surrendered. I'm sure this emboldened John. I don't think he liked what he had to do, but his path was really set. In a few months, the political power changed in Kansas. A more neutral governor was appointed, and all the abolitionist laws were eliminated, and John was free to leave. Now he relied on his benefactors on the east, and so he headed east. And among his supporters were a number of very wealthy people, and some of them were very large in the literature world and in the world of politics. His goal was to go to Chatham, Ontario, Canada. Now this was a successful colony of escaped slaves and white farmers who lived together, worked together, John's model of integration. And he was able to garner only, I think, less than 30 followers, and they laid out the plans to raid the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The object there was to capture the weaponry there, distribute them to the slaves, and start a slave revolt that would end slavery. However, one of his more trusted lieutenants took the plans and headed for Washington. Now John was on a very tight time frame. He had to move, and his strong-willed character backed that, and he did just that. He moved. He stockpiled munitions and arms in Topeka, Kansas, at a sympathizer's home, shipped them to a farm called Dr. Kennedy's farm, about 4 miles from Harper's Ferry. And he had people coming in from the east who were going to join his militia, filtering in. The farm was supposed to be a staging point for cattle going to market. So the neighbors, already suspicious, kept watch on the farm for any unusual activity. So this farmhouse was a two-room affair, one upstairs and one downstairs. And upstairs is where the men lived, slept, and drilled. After a while, it got a little crowded up there. Sarah and Annie at one point came in and they did the cooking and the cleaning, but the men had to stay inside. After a while, cabin fever had its way, and the men began to roam out through the woods, and that was noticed by the neighbors. Word got back to John that he only had about a week before the militia would arrive at the farm to find out what was going on. He also went broke. But at the last minute, he got a benefactor to donate $600 and join his group. And he was able to pull off the raid at Harper's Ferry. And we all know what happened there. So I'm going to leave it to you. Was John Brown a madman or a saint? That's up to you to decide. Thank you.
John Brown, in his failed attempt at Harper's Ferry, he was captured, hanged by the state of Virginia in 1859. And that left Mary Brown and the children living at this farm in North Elba, New York. Now, John had not been there all that often. He's off, starting insurrections. And Mary's trying to carry on at this farm. The land had been donated by Gerrit Smith to not only the Brown family, but also to settle free blacks on farms in this area. The trouble was that it was a hard scrabble life. The soil was thin, it's rocky, hilly country. It really wasn't good for farming. And a lot of the other families left. The daughter Abby Brown, Abby Brown was not a daughter, she was married to Salmon Brown. I think it's Salmon Brown, the son, but it looks like salmon, But anyway, she says, we lived 6 years in that cold, inhospitable climate, which as one man expressed it, had 6 months of winter, and the other 6 months was mighty cold weather. And if you've ever lived in upstate New York, that's what it's pretty much like. But she says, we were contented with our lot. They would have stayed there the rest of their lives. But an uncle came back from California, And he painted this glowing picture of the climate and the soil and the healthy living. And so they decided to immigrate to California. Because life, I mean, they were living this poverty-stricken life in New York, except that some benefactors had taken Sarah and Annie, two of the daughters, and given them an education, taken them to Concord and put them in school so they could get an education. Other than that, they were just, getting by on the farm. So they decide to go to California, but when they got to Iowa, it actually looked pretty nice, and they thought, well, maybe we'll settle here in Iowa. But it turned out to be a very hard winter in Iowa, and they thought, maybe California would be better after all. So they got together 3 wagons. It was Mary Brown, John Brown's widow, Annie, who was age 20, Sarah, who was 17, Ellen, who was the youngest at 9. There was also Salmon Brown, who was 27, his wife Abby, and they had 2 small children. And they also took along 2 other men to drive the wagons. This was pretty common for a young man to say, I'll go along to work on the road to get myself to California. And they had 6 merino sheep in one of the wagons. This was going to be their start in California in the sheep business. I thought it was cute that Abby Brown said, to keep my youngest child, who was 13 months old when we started, from straying away while I was busy, I often tied her with a long rope to the wagon wheel. So that's how you did it. There were no playpens. The Brown, as we said, the Browns had 20 children, but several of those children had died at infancy. Sarah Brown, for instance, was the second Sarah. There had been another Sarah who died as a baby. And so when she was born, she was named Sarah. I think there might have been another Ellen, too. By this time, several of the sons had died in some of these military activities. And so, but Salmon Brown had been in Kansas with his father in the Osawatomie raid that Ron talked about. And so this is going to cause a problem for them. These are just some pictures of life on the trail. There was a young man named Daniel Jenks who did these drawings. There were rivers to cross. It was fairly uneventful, though, until they got through Wyoming, as we'll see, when they met up with the Howard wagon train. I thought I had a map here. What did I do with the map? There it is. We'll go back to the map for a second. That's where I was going to use this pointer. Although this is going to be tricky. But, they're in Iowa. Council Bluffs is here. They start off from Council Bluffs, go up the Platte River like everybody did. Up here, that's where Casper, Wyoming is right there. They would have gone past Fort Laramie. And South Pass is here. And just about that time, hold that for me, Ron, thank you, because I'm going to want it again. Okay. Just about that time, they started off by themselves with 3 wagons. They met another group, joined up with a larger train, but that train turned south toward Denver because there was gold strikes in Denver by that time. So then they were alone for a while, and then they met up with a group from Indiana, and they joined up with this Indiana group. And they liked the people from Indiana. They were fine with them, but there was a lot of worry about Indian activities, and The Indiana train had been attacked a few days earlier. It was felt their numbers were still not sufficient protection, and they joined a train of 80 wagons that overtook them. So that was the Howard wagon train. The Howard wagon train was from Tennessee. And when they found out that John Brown's son and the rest of the family were in this little wagon train, they started making plans against them. Abby says, "We had not been with this train long before we felt there was something wrong. We traveled with them several days, and finally our Indiana friends found out that they planned to kill us and told us of it. We hardly knew whether to believe them or not, but two young men from Virginia came to Mr. Brown," that's Salmon, "and corroborated the story. They said they were Southerners, but they were opposed to any of that thing of that kind, but other men in the group were not." Well, what do you do? This is Salmon Brown in his old age in Portland, Oregon, which is where he ended up. Well, a tire came off. They decided to make camp. Salmon's gotten this warning. He says, "I'm going to continue just over that rise, and I'll camp on the other side." And men in the Howard train tried to stop him from going. He said, "No, I'll just be just over the rise." But he knew that they would come after him that night, and then they could claim that Indians had attacked them and blame it on the Indians. So he just kept going. They just kept traveling all night long until they caught up with their Indiana group. So these wagon trains, kind of would get ahead of each other, would get behind each other, would join up, would split up. But there was a good reason for them to split off from that particular group. That Howard wagon train followed them all the way to Camp Connor, which was at Soda Springs in Idaho. It's near Pocatello. And there they told their story to the soldiers who were Union soldiers. This is 1864. I mean, the war is still going on, right? And there were soldiers stationed at a number of forts in the West. A lot of them were manned with men from California, mainly to protect settlers against Indians. This is a letter she wrote to her sister-in-law. I won't read the whole thing to you, but she said the soldiers, or at least the lieutenant at the fort, made everyone in all these wagon trains take a loyalty oath. The Southerners did not want to do that, but they wouldn't let them leave until they'd taken a loyalty oath to the Union. And then the soldiers escorted the Brown family another 200 miles along the trail until and by then, and I need my little stick again, because this map kind of confused me, which is why I thought I'd show it to you. That didn't make much sense, but if you are a pioneer on the trail to California, you're going along the Humboldt River here, and it says immigrant. It would have said immigrant road. So they're going along there, and the California Trail goes down here to the end of the Humboldt River and then continues on. But by 1864, there were other ways to get there than taking the California Trail. And they linked up with this road right here. This is the road that takes you straight to Red Bluff. It's the Red Bluff Wagon Road. And this is the Lassen Trail going up here, but that had been used. The Lassen Trail had been used quite a bit in 1849 and 1850, but it didn't turn out to be a really good route. And so the Lassen Trail wasn't used much anymore, I don't think. But by 1863, 1864, there were a number of wagon roads, like the Red Bluff Wagon Road and John Bidwell's Humboldt Wagon Road, between California and Nevada. So they took the Red Bluff Wagon Road, which is why they ended up in Red Bluff. That was all there was to it. They arrived in Red Bluff, and it was in the newspaper. Large immigrant train from the east by the plains across arrived in town. Among the number was the wife, son, and 3 daughters of John Brown, the hero of Harper's Ferry notoriety, and the frightener of the great state of Virginia with his 7 men and a cow. You see, this is a newspaper, the Red Bluff Semi-Weekly Independent, that is a Union newspaper, a Republican newspaper. And so they are mocking the state of Virginia that was frightened by John Brown, his 7 men and a cow. I don't know where the cow comes into it. But Abby Brown said, "We reached Red Bluff, a hungry, almost barefoot, ragged lot of immigrants. But people came generously to our aid and gave us food and clothes." And the majority of the people in Red Bluff were very supportive of the Union, and they were, very supportive of the Brown family. And eventually, maybe after they'd been there a few months or so, there was a movement to build a home for Widow Brown and her children. Now, Solomon Brown had rented some land, and he was getting his sheep business going. But they built a little house in Red Bluff for the family. This is again from the Red Bluff Independent. There was a notice that this proposal had come from a San Francisco newspaper, which I'd never heard of, the San Francisco American Flag. I think it was short-lived. But that, this was a needy family. A lot of people admired John Brown. We should help out the family. And the article in the Red Bluff Independent concluded, "Here is $5. How many others will contribute an equal amount or more or less? Let's help out this family." Now, there were 2 newspapers in Red Bluff. Red Bluff was a prosperous town. It could afford 2 newspapers, 2 semi-weekly papers. This was from the Red Bluff Independent, but the other paper was the Red Bluff Beacon, which was the founded earlier, and it was a Democratic paper. Newspapers were where you got all your news and information. Newspapers were very politically biased. There was no attempt to be unbiased or middle of the road or anything. So the Beacon was a Democratic paper, and it did not write nice articles about John Brown's family. Independent was a Union paper or a Republican paper, and it did have a different take on the Brown family. And it's kind of interesting. My chapter of the book is about the newspapers in Red Bluff and the political things, but it's kind of interesting to go back and see those old newspapers, partly just because, the advertisements are so entertaining. But they would really go after each other. The editor of the Independent is calling the editor of the Beacon a traitorous copperhead. A copperhead was a peace Democrat, someone who said, if the South wants to have slavery, we'll let those states do that. We don't want a war, we just want the status quo, the way it was before the war. If they want slavery, we'll have slavery. If they want slavery in the territories, they can have slavery in the territories. They were all right with that. And that would be a Democratic paper. The Democratic side, they'd really very much split up at that point. But they would look at the Beacon, or the Independent, the Republican newspaper. They're a bunch of black Republicans. They'll give, they want to give everybody the vote and everything. They look down on them. So there was a lot of this back and forth between them. And in a minute, I'll tell you a little more about the papers. But as I said, she had 3 daughters with her. Mary Brown had 3 daughters with her. Sarah and Annie. Annie was the older. They both became school teachers. And one of them, and no one's been able to figure out which one, became a teacher at the Oat Creek School, which was a school for colored children. There was an area where the family of Pleasant D. Logan and Alvin Coffey had settled, and those children weren't allowed to go to school with the white children, and besides they needed a little school near their homes, so there was a separate school for African American children. And one of the Brown daughters taught there, and the newspapers only call her Miss Brown. Miss Brown. Miss Sarah or Miss Annie? We don't know. Annie did marry Samuel Adams, a blacksmith, and Salmon Brown was finding the job of raising sheep in the Central Valley pretty tough. It's not a good place for raising sheep. So he decided to move over to the coast. He moved over to Humboldt County. And Annie and her husband, Samuel, went along with them. And also Sarah and the youngest daughter, Ellen, met and married a man named James Fablinger. Sarah never married herself, but she did become quite an accomplished artist. And these are her charcoal and pencil sketches of, no, I wouldn't call them sketches, portraits of her parents. They're based on photographs. The one of John Brown is definitely taken off a photograph, but they're excellent. And these are in the Saratoga they belong to the Saratoga Historical Foundation. They have a museum there in Saratoga and Santa Clara County, which is where the whole family ended up settling. Not Salmon. He eventually migrated up to Portland. But Mrs. Brown, Sarah, Annie, and Ellen all ended up in Saratoga, or near Saratoga. And while they were still living, just to demonstrate the difference between the newspapers, while they were still living in Red Bluff in 1867, the Beacon had been replaced by another paper called the Sentinel, but it was still a Democratic paper, and the Sentinel was criticizing John Swett, who was the superintendent of schools for California. And also, I found out, a friend of John Muir and John Bidwell. Prominent man, but he was the state superintendent of public instruction, and they wrote of him, Swett is trying to fan the flames of discord by magnifying the virtues of old John Brown, the horse thief and murderer, and training the voices of pupils of the schools under his charge to sing paeans of praise to his soul. In other words, putting John Brown's Body, the song, in the curriculum. The Independent took exception to that. The question with us now is this: is the editor of the Sentinel a hyena, that he must drag dead men from their graves for no other reason than to prove his own origin and species? Or has he John Brown on the brain and knows no other way to rid himself of the ghost that haunts him? And complained that to put something like that in the paper in 1867 when John Brown's widow is living in that town was insensitive, to say the least. But of course he says it more strongly than that. He calls him a hyena. Mrs. Brown, I was almost going to skip this part because Laney is going to tell you more about this photograph. But just the connection to Butte County and Tehama County, only 5 of those 20 children that were born to the 2 wives of John Brown survived to adulthood and had descendants. Of course, several of them died in infancy, as we said. One of them was, one descendant is Stephen Salmon Scott, who was the grandson of Salmon and Abby Brown. And he settled in Chico and was a beekeeper. and is buried in the Chico Cemetery. And Maxine and Darrell Robinson, he was the great-grandson of Annie Brown, who was married to the blacksmith, whose name has already escaped me, Adams. And they had this daguerreotype of John Brown. And daguerreotypes, you only get one of them. There's no negative of a daguerreotype. It's a one-time production. So to find a new daguerreotype of somebody as famous as John Brown is pretty special. And Lee's going to tell you about that in just a moment because I'm almost done. I was just going to say that they lived near Saratoga, and that's where they're buried. I visited there to do some research at the Saratoga Museum. And walked up to the cemetery, and there's the gravesite of Mary Brown, wife of John Brown of Harper's Ferry, and Sarah Brown and Ellen Brown Fablinger. And with that, I will turn the time over to Lee to tell you a little bit about that photograph. Or I should say that daguerreotype.
Well, thank you for the brief introduction, and thank you all for coming so I can share my part of the story with you. I've been a camera collector, photography collector, going back over 50 years when I started this in college. And over the years, it's something that's been a lot of fun for me. I think some of the roots of that are with my father and grandfather. My grandfather was a newspaper man, and I still have the negatives that he took of the 1906 earthquake and fire. And then many, many photos that he took over his entire lifetime. Anyway, I think that might have been part of my interest in photography. So among collectible photos are what we call cased images, and that may be something you're familiar with. It's like a little book, and the outside often is decorated, and then the inside will have a portrait, typically a portrait of the sitter. And the earliest photographs, the earliest successful photographic process was the daguerreotype. That was invented in 1839. By a Frenchman in Paris, Mr. Daguerre, of course. So during the 1840s, that was really the only process available. If you look at the subsequent processes, typically people think of all of those images that are in little cases. They're sort of called generically tintypes, but there's actually a variety of photos as photography evolved that show up in those. Again, the earliest were daguerreotypes, popular maybe 1850, 1855. For a brief while, there were images were on glass called an ambrotype. Those appeared up into the Civil War. And from the Civil War on, they were tintypes. They were photographs on tin. But the daguerreotypes are very, very distinctive. It was made by coating a copper plate with a vapor of mercury. Not a sensible thing to do, and not something that everybody survived. But that is, after the exposure is made in the camera, it is fixed with chemicals, and it has a mirror-like surface. So unlike all the other photos, a daguerreotype looks like a mirror in some respects. You have to hold it just right to get the image. So, fast forward, a group of friends and myself do a little local antiques roadshow. We've got one coming up for the Chico Museum. We've done it for a variety of local nonprofits. People bring their antique items for appraisal, and typically they pay $5 each, and that goes to the host organization. So we donate our time, and it makes some money for the local nonprofits. We're a fun group. We know each other through collecting. We enjoy being together, and everybody has a little different specialty, and one of mine is photography. So in about 2006, we were up in Tehama, which is hardly a town, and they have a museum there though, and we were there to benefit that museum. The way it works is the people will bring something to the front counter, and the people there decide who to assign that to, who has the expertise. And I believe it was Randy, who's in here somewhere, that was up front and opened this envelope and saw this daguerreotype and had them come to my table. It was an older lady. She brought it out, and I immediately recognized it was John Brown. It was, it still sort of gives me goosebumps to think that this was in my hands and something that was a new discovery. So I told her, and she said, this was my relatives. This was given to me and my husband in 1949 when we were married by my husband's grandmother, who was a descendant of John Brown from Red Bluff. So in my amazement, I said, if you would like to sell this, it is worth tens of thousands of dollars. Right now, I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of dollars, but if you'd like me to, I can help you find a market for this. And she went home and she was agreeable to that. I think she talked to her children and decided, yes, she would like to sell it and would allow me to work on her behalf to do that. She was very careful. All of a sudden, the daguerreotype went, it was in a drawer, she said, all these years. Now it's in the safe deposit box. So I contact some of the major auction houses. Photography, when I started collecting, photography was not considered an art. Photographs were not especially valuable. I think the highest price paid for one back in the 60s or 70s was maybe $40,000. Now they're in the millions of dollars. Anyway, so I knew that this had value, and there were auction houses that had specialty auctions. Christie's was one. I'm trying to remember the other big one. Sotheby's. Big names in New York that have annual auctions. And then there was one in Cincinnati, Cowan's auction. And I had seen him on Antiques Roadshow. Maybe you've seen Wes Cowan. He typically comes out when they have photos. And I contacted that. So that was, I think those are the three that I contacted. I believe it was in my conversation with Cowan's auction that they said this would be close to $100,000. And actually, the market had slumped. Prior to that, there had been several heavy hitters in the photography business that had been competing, and that was no longer going on, so the prices were down a bit. And, as it turned out, another photo, very similar to this one, had also come to the market that the Smithsonian had ended up with. And I think they thought that might have gone for something like $125,000. So we went ahead and got the daguerreotype into the hands of the auction house in Cincinnati. They did a wonderful presentation of it. Oh, now I remember. The reason I chose Cowan's is it was such a prestigious item for them that they waived the fee to the seller. Wow. So that meant Maxine was going to get 100% of the sales of that daguerreotype. They put it on the front of their catalog, and this is the picture that was on the front of the catalog. They did a wonderful write-up. They did 2 pages of research and chronicled how this had descended in the family, They compared it with the other photo that the Smithsonian had, and as it turned out, both of these were made by a black photographer, which was very unusual. And he was only in the photography business for a couple of years, and they dated this to 1848, which was 10 years before his attack on Harper's Ferry. He didn't have any notoriety back then, but he was heavily involved in the abolitionist movement. The other daguerreotype that's in the possession of the Smithsonian, he's holding a banner and he's saluting. He's wearing the same clothes. It was taken on the same, obviously it was taken on the same day. It was taken in Hartford, Connecticut, where Augustus Washington had his studio. He would have known Augustus Washington because Augustus Washington was a black man, but was also active in the abolitionist movement. His daguerreotypes are very, very scarce. What was a sort of an interesting coincidence, probably 10 years before that, I'd been in Washington, D.C., and they had an exhibit of daguerreotypes by Augustus Washington. I had no idea that I would encounter this, maybe one of his most important photographs, years from that time. So it went to the auction. Maxine and her family were able to follow it. It must have been on the internet. It went for, I think it was about $90,000, and it ended up being sold to a museum in Kansas. So, as you know, Kansas was pivotal in John Brown's development and in the abolitionist movement, et cetera, et cetera. We were all satisfied that it ended up in a destination that was very fitting for this important piece of American history. Maxine's husband was the great-great-grandson of John Brown. I had no idea that there was a Brown connection here in Northern California, but the Browns had been here all those generations. Again, it was given to Maxine and her husband when they were married. She didn't have any idea of its value. Like I said, it was just in a drawer, not anything special. I think she said they'd seen Antiques Roadshow, as many people have, and it sort of brought to light some of the things that are of significant values, and that was the reason she brought it in. So here was something of great historic importance that had been just hidden away here in Northern California that came to light and now is available. I'm assuming it's on exhibit in Kansas. It's something that's sort of part of our heritage and can be widely shared. I'll close with just one of the ironies to me. My entire career has been in the nonprofit sector, and I did lots of publicity and wrote many, many press releases. So I wrote a press release about the sales of this important American artifact. And I contacted our local papers and the papers up in Red Bluff. Zero coverage. So thus nobody heard about it here. The irony is the auction house sent it out on the Associated Press wire service. This went out nationally, and the stories appeared in publications throughout the United States, but we had no news of it here. Such is the media. That's all I have to share. Thank you.
Yes, we have a couple of questions first there, and then, yes.
Hi,
Dear.
I have a question, because have any of the people who have researched the Brown family run across an area called African Valley, which was, I believe, a little west of Red Rock? And if so, was there any connection with the Brown family? Is that an area that they raised livestock in or anything like that?
I don't know if there's a direct connection to the Brown family, but I do know that Red Bluff, Tehama County was an area that had a number of colored people and a countable number of mixed marriages. And so there was quite a bit of both official and personal interconnections with them.
Okay.
And I'm not terribly surprised because of that there would be a name like African Valley, but I did not run across it in any of the things that I read.
And I didn't either. I don't think there's a connection to the Brown family.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Was in republication from the paperback,
Uh-huh.
I assume things have been written or was edited or?
We've added a lot. We added a lot of photographs. This does contain Wilbert Fay's original story. And that goes up until about here. And then Ron has a chapter on John Brown. I have a chapter on newspapers in Red Bluff. Josie, who wasn't able to be here today, Josie is not only one of the authors of this, but she's also the editor. She does the beautiful layout and is an excellent copy editor. She did all the stuff about the Howard wagon train and their encounter with that. And also in the back there are some family history things of the Brown family of two of the other sons, Owen and Jason Brown, who also settled in California, but they didn't come to Northern California, so they're not part of this story. But this has got a lot in it, and we're really very happy to bring it to the public because it's local history, but it's also national history.
We were also able to add a little segment on a man that
Oh yes,
the blacksmith Adams tangled with. And this guy is, I wrote a little first-person story about his life. Definitely a Democrat, but also the kind of guy who would be a bouncer in a bar, or I think he had a protection racket for to guard Chinese miners so their gold wouldn't be stolen from them, and a number of other things.
McTurk.
McTurk. And so there's a story in there about James McTurk, and I think you'll enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to research.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to read. Yes, well, we got two hands there.
Is the current Red Bluff Daily News the current edition of one of those two?
Not that I know of. I don't think so. I think all three of the papers, the Beacon, the Independent, and the Sentinel, all went out of business at some point and another newspaper started up. Yes?
Yeah, there were a number of people in this area who supported the Confederacy.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes.
They gave John Bidwell a certain amount of trouble because he was a big Union supporter. Did the family have any trouble with any of them?
You'll have to read the book. There are a couple stories in the book about incidents in Red Bluff of rebel rousing and hurrahing for Jeff Davis.
Right.
The majority of the population in Red Bluff and in Chico, supported the Union cause, but there's a significant number of Southern sympathizers at that time. Yes.
Not that I know anything other than local stories, but for 4 years I looked across the street and saw that house.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I opened the A&W root beer stand across the street from it. And I visited with all the neighbors and the person over there at the house. And so we heard all about John Brown's family being there. And the lady in the front row lived across the street also.
Yeah, and yet I don't think there's any sign in front of the house that says,
There never was.
yeah,
I lived at 136 Main Street.
Oh.
right across the street.
But who's ever lived in this house, we were telling my brother we're coming, he said his name was Brown at this time. This is in the 1900 or 1900. He put his Christmas tree lights up and would never get them down until April. thought his name was John Brown, because it was good for the Josie.
I don't know about that. No. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Very good.